Welcome, everyone. This is Tristan McGough, yours truly today, hosting Intermediate Selfology, where today we're going to be talking about the notational set. Notations and notions, terms and thoughts. And we're going to see how meaning is linked to various symbols and signs. So we're going to be linking the terms and the thoughts today, and this is extremely important philosophically speaking, because unless meaning is built, there is not an expanding sense of self. The expanding sense of self, recall, when we were interpreting the message of Maya, the component that related to the mind itself, to the intellect, has to do with meaning. And the philosopher is essentially concerned with meaning. Meaning in the broad sense of taking all the various ideas and providing the big picture, or what we call a worldview, a coherent, consistent worldview that is complete. That's the ideal. The second is to critically analyze any proposition or any statement, assertion that is ever made, and determine its truth value. That is to see whether it is true or not, whether it corresponds to anything we might think of in reality, or whether it doesn't. When a philosopher wishes to articulate ideas, these ideas can be articulated, of course, through the written form, or they can be done verbally, or they can be done, as I often do, expressively. And like any profession or any person, you have a creative expressional side in which your artistry will flow. So for some other individual, they might find their creative artistry in singing some of this, as Milarepa did, the famed Tibetan yogi with his thousands of songs, 100,000 songs of Milarepa. And other individuals find that the visual arts are more of a medium, and others will find music, of course, and all of that goes on. But the idea is in building meaning, philosophically, is you're building greater meaning, because you are taking not merely what you can describe in the empirical finite world, but you are looking how that makes sense, how it has meaning within a grander scope that encompasses such things as the mind and the psyche and the inner scape that you necessarily experience right here, right now, and you can reflect that at any moment as a selfologist. You can call it to the surface. I am conscious of being conscious. And at that moment, you have reflexively grasped what you already are. That is a self-consciousness that's transparent to itself in what we call apperception. So what we're really doing philosophically is we're building worldviews that are justified through a critique of any individual statement that may be a component of that worldview. But there's a third fundamental feature to the philosophic life that is not often spoken of, or it's left to the realm of mysticism or esotericism or various kinds of meditative disciplines. But that is, of course, the experiential component. Every omniphilosopher has three components, therefore. What they might be considered as making a functional omniphilosopher. And that is, there's the critical function, which we've mentioned. There's the worldview function, or the architectonic function. And then there's the esoteric, or what is really the paleogenetic function. It is a rebirthing of consciousness from one moment to another that is established through direct perception. That is through paying attention to what's already happening naturally through your pristine cognitions. So these three components, the critical and the worldview building and the experiential, constitute the functional life of an omniphilosopher. Now you can look at it like this. Take a mountain, and on the mountaintop you can have a view of the surrounding countryside. That's a worldview in terms of this analogy. And then if you were to go down into the valley, particular orchard, a particular tree, and grab a specific fruit and cut into it, you would be looking critically, analytically, at what you had surveyed only from a large perspective, a big picture perspective as a worldview. However, whether you're down there in the valley testing fruit, or whether you're up there on the mountain surveying the entire 360 vista, you are always experiencing it as yourself, as a conscious being. So what I do in terms of philosophic talking, as a selfologist, I bring these ideas to your attention so that you can build greater meaning. Not just the meaning that accounts for the outer scape, not just the meanings that you establish in your own mind, in your own inner scape of feelings and thoughts, but the greater scape in which all of that is founded and established, and which is its essential ground. And being the ground, it is here now, it is everywhere, it is indispensable to finite functioning and the transfinite experiencing. But all these ideas, they are all based upon terminology, is it not? And a lot of this is new or reworked or redefined terminology, and some of it is outrightly neologistic. That is, it's a new word that is being created from the start. So with our 6 ideas of the 7 various pristine cognitions we were talking about, that if we were to suspend 6 of them and look only at the cognos aspect, that's what we're dealing with here in terms of the notational set. It's a way that cognos functions in terms of the establishment of meaning. Because when we look at the notational set, I want you to take a look at the bottom notation. It's a meaningful sign. Now, a sign can be actually 3 different things, but we'll get to that later. Right now, let's just consider it as a linguistic symbol, all right? Like a word that we're used to, such as emptiness or self or tree or anything that you can imagine putting the word to, that's a notation. So, of course, in terms of semiotics, which is the study of signs, all 3 of the different kinds of signs, semantics is a subdivision of that in which you're dealing with the arbitrary assignment, basically, of a figure or form, such as this word notation in the English language, and hooking it to a meaning. So when I use the word notation, that's a meaningful sign. But its meaning is multifaceted, and this is what I wanted to show you today. In terms of any time that we use terms, there are multiple meanings, and they are usually sedimented and layered, sometimes hierarchically organized in your own preferential psychical system. And that being the case, I wanted to deconstruct that, to analyze it, to take that critical function of philosophy and look at how it corresponds to the semantic component of our consciousness, where we find meaning and establish meaning, and we talk about meaning through notation. So, we have a meaningful sign, and that's where we'll begin. I, of course, use one of my most preferred geometric shapes for description, interpretation, and explanation, and that is the octahedron, because it allows us to break apart analytically and see the various components and how structurally they're interrelated. So the notation itself is actually the endpoint of all the various meanings that are fed into any particular sign. The most common form of meanings are all captured in a dictionary, and these are the connotations. These are defined meanings. For instance, in the Oxford English Dictionary, you can find 35 different meanings to the word self. So the defined meanings as well are all conceptual. That's connotation. The denotation is the object or the thing that's meant or intended. It's the referent. So if I use the word tree, and we can define that as a particular botanical configuration through a dictionary definition, I can also point to a particular tree because that is what the meaning is referring to by way of the notation. All this is going on as a matter of interpretation in your own mind at any given moment. Right now, you are undergoing the renotation. That is, you are taking meanings from what I'm saying. It's the meaning taken. In my own mind, I have a renotation that's currently underway in terms of this entire notational set, which therefore brings us to the pre-notations. These are preferred meanings. These are things with which I already have experience. I already have experience with all of these terms. These are part of my pre-notations. Each of us, from every time that we've used a term, from every time we've had a thought that corresponds with that term, however fuzzy or hazy, however foggy or dull, nevertheless, it has played into your own ideo notation. That is your own personalized constellation of meaning. No one else has the constellation in your innerscape. When you look up into the stars of your innerscape as a psyche, you have ideas that are connected in absolutely customized ways to your own self-consciousness. And that's your innerscape, which is all, if you were talking about it and articulating it in information theory, according to the Laplace paradigm here, in the universal world, all the information there is all contained and it's all interconnected. And all you have to do is understand what any given point or idea that you have is, and you will understand its relationship to the other informational dots in your mental universe. So, when we're talking about any given notation, it can be a category, as I mentioned before, like tree. It can be an individual person. It can be a preferred painting. It can be anything that you can name and you can offer a term for. You are going to be thinking about it in your own mind. You're going to be pulling it from your own complex of ideatic experience. There are going to be certain preferred meanings you have because of the way that you are characterally structured. And there are certain defined meanings that you have taken, and you could recite almost dictionary perfect. Most of us can't on any given term. Nonetheless, it went into helping form, when you read it through renotation, to become part of your idionotation as a psychical being, as a human being with self-consciousness. And of course, it doesn't matter what term that it is, you can usually point to it and refer to it. And if you can't, then it's an abstract idea. So if we talk about an abstract idea, we're taking, instead of a concrete tree that I can point to, and we're saying something such as treeness. Every tree has a quality of treeness, an abstract quality that it necessarily must have in order to exist as that particular species that we call a tree. And of course, then when you get to connotations and dictionary definitions, there's going to be synonyms that are words very much and close alike: bliss, happiness, pleasure, gratification, ecstasy, rapture. All of these terms have shades of different meaning. Nonetheless, they could be used up to a certain point as a group of synonyms. But then there are antonyms. There are words, terms, notations that are opposite. And you can make a complete study of synonymics or antonymics. And then there are, of course, the hyponyms. Those are the specifics. For instance, a category of a flower, gardenia, is a hyponym to the word flower. In other words, genus, species, class, subclass. Now you reverse that around, and of course then you have a hypernym. And that's where treeness is a hyponym to any given tree. As an example we gave before, or reverse it around, and the flower is the hypernym to the hyponym of the gardenia. All right, so now that we see how words work with one another within a semantic context, we understand in terms of selfology that what I'm attempting to do is utilize, by way of cognostic art, which is this expressive component we were talking about, as well as philosophic talk, which is intended to selfologize. That is, to bring you to a point where you personally apply the ideas right now, here, to yourself at any given moment. So, with that in mind, we've taken a look here fundamentally at what constitutes the notational set. The only thing I hadn't mentioned so far is all possible meanings, and that is the meta-notation. Now, you can certainly look upon meta-notation as the deep structure from which all the possible different notations can be derived: denotation, connotation, renotation, prenotation, and idionotation, right down as they are anchored and assigned through conventional agreement to a notation, right? We may have adopted the Phoenician alphabet in great part, but when it comes to mathematical language, the zero was adopted from Arabia through India. So you have different kinds of notations that are been incorporated throughout history, and the connotations, therefore, will differ from one time period to another. This brings me to speaking about the notational set here in modern terminology for those of you who are philosophically astute and have studied such things as Charles Sanders Peirce or some of the other famous philosophers of language, whether it's Austin or Searle. And the commonly agreed upon semiotic terms today in standard semiotics or semiology is sign, and that is, of course, the notation, the signifier, such as this word, S-I-G-N, signifies the idea of sign. And I could point and say, this is a representative of sign. In other words, that would be a referent. That's an example. So a sign for apple is the word apple. The referent is the actual apple that would be sitting on the table. And the meaning, the sense, is the dictionary definition that's usually given. So here you see I've color-coded these. So the defined meaning, the sense, that's the meaning signified. All right. The referent, that's your denotation. That's the object you can point to and that you mean. And the sign is, of course, the notation down here. Now, the great expansion that Charles Sanders Peirce did for the semiotic field is he opened up the idea of the interpretant. And the interpretant is actually the one that does the extrapolating of meaning, that is, they impact the meaning, or they interpolate the meaning. They go, well, between my meaning of this and my meaning of that, I think this fits in right here. So all of that interpretant is the blue box, that rectangle that I've indicated here. So that includes all those possible meanings of the meta-notation as well as the ideo, pre, and renotations, the meaning you're actually taking, the preferred meanings that may pop into mind. For instance, when we use particular words, and again, this is part of the pragmatic aspect of semiotics, that is, how do you use these words? Well, you know, there are a lot of preferred meanings that pop into mind when one uses a brand image. And so therefore, in media and in advertising and marketing, you'll find semantics being employed in the most direct and commercially enhanced ways, or I should say enhancing ways. All right, so now we're talking about the interpretant, and this is where it gets interesting because that all has to do with you and I in our innerscape, because our own complex of notations and meanings, our own thought system, whether it's a worldview or it's the methodology that we approach when we analyze something or we listen to anything, it has to be something that's arranged hierarchically because we don't pay attention, we don't prefer everything, we prefer certain things, and this is part of where desire and clinging are find a home, because this is their base when they established a preferred meaning among many meanings. However, every time that we think about something, we are engaged in renotation. However, I wanted to call attention, before I wrap things up here for the moment, to the three kinds of signs or notations. Okay, the first is a semblant. That's an icon. That is it's a natural image. For instance, we've all seen a photograph. Well, a photograph is an icon or a semblant of the real person. It's not the actual person. A sketch could do just as well. Very often, a sign like a Ped Zing sign, you'll have a figure of, a stick figure of a person that's walking across through a crosswalk. Well, that's a semblant, that's an icon, that's a natural image. It's very much like what it signifies. When we're talking about signification, we're talking about something that is asking to be noticed. It's notifying, right? It's reality notifying you in one way or another. The second kind of sign is a symptom. Now, this has to do with such things that indicate something. For instance, dark clouds. They're a symptom of what? Possible rain. A smile or frown, facial expression. It's symptomatic of what? A feeling, an emotion. So you see there is a connection there between something which is a symptom or an indicator and its cause. And so, for instance, a knock on the door. Well, you're not going to get a knock on the door from a squirrel or a cat or an elephant in all probability. You're only going to get it from a human being who has a rational mind, that is a mind that ratios things. So, you know, whether it's or it's, doesn't matter what it is. You go, well, that's a ratio, that's a rational mind. You're doing all of this intuitively, or it's split-second lightning speed. But that is only a symptom. That knock is just a symptom of what? A symptom of somebody visiting you. You don't know who's visiting you. You got to find out. What's the cause of the symptom? So that's the second kind of sign. So knocks are signs, a flashing red light, right? What is that a sign of? You're supposed to stop. These are things that we associate. And then there are the symbols, and those are the signs that we are very familiar with in terms of language, because we have actual vocabularies for mathematics and geometry and any kind of science, and particularly medical science. There's a whole lexicon, a whole registrar of words that are there and ready to be utilized at any time, but it's all conventional. It's not a natural image like with a semblant or an icon, right? Like a photograph or a sketch. It's not like a symptom in which there's this mixed element that's going on there, and the kind of natural image, which is whether it's a cloud or whether it's a smile. These are things that have a underlying cause to them. However, when it comes to a symbol, it's all artificial. It's an artifice. It is something that is man-made. It's a human contrivance and it's convention. That's why you can have all these different languages in the world, because there are all the agreements of those who speak that mother tongue that a particular letter or ideogram is going to be connected with this particular phoneme. Right? And when it comes to phonemes, in the human language, there's usually about 10 to 40 phonemes in a given language around that. Some have much more. I think the highest is 140 phonemes used in a single language, and the lowest is like around 10. So you have all these different physical components of dividing space up syllabically in order to have a phonetic sense of meaning. And then, of course, when we turn it into graphemes, into written symbols, this is what we get. This is what is established. So philosophically speaking, when we are looking at any given sign, we want to be keenly aware that there are dictionary definitions that go into that particular sign. For instance, look up the word self, look up the word emptiness, look up the word individuality, look up the word mind, in a dictionary. That's going to be the connotation. Now, as you're reading that, just as you're reading any of this or listening to me, you're going through a renotation, a renotative process, thinking. You actually have thoughts that are attached to each one of those words, either that you hear or that you read. And that's all, of course, founded upon your complex of ideas in the ideo-notation. That is your thought structure and system in your own psyche, of which you have a hierarchicalized preference in your prenotations. And if you live in the finite world, or you're talking using language to talk about language, like maybe math as a distillation of language to symbolize certain quantitative elements, all of that is denotation. It is something that you can actually point to, and something to which you can actually have a finite image. Now, that's not the case with abstract ideas, and that in the world of philosophy is what necessarily must be entailed, because doing any kind of critical analysis, you have to distill it to certain set of concepts, which, as we talked about, have a defined meaning. And you should be able to point, at least as I do here in cognostic artwork, to what I intend, what I mean. Because the ultimate end of a philosopher's palaver, of philosophic talk, is that understanding ensues in the listener. So that's the primary purpose, why a philosopher attempts to, at any given moment, to unpack the various meanings for the audience to which is attending contemplatively to what's going on, that is, thoughtfully to what's occurring. When we're speaking in terms of selfology as the study of the 10-dimensional self, what we are doing is we are breaking new ground. We are taking some of our preconceived notions and we are abandoning them, such as the idea that there's a permanent, partless, independent self, a little fixed, massive point crunched to singularity that somehow is distinct from everything else in the universe. Not so. That's a false notion. That's a notion that constricts the very idea of what even a conscious being is, as cognos, as one of the 7 pristine ideas. So even if you strip all the other ideas away, such as the one self and the real self and the whole self and the expanding self, if you take all those different selves and go, well, there's just the conscious self, cognos. Well, cognos is not just a crunched down singularity, what is sometimes referred to in philosophy as Atman, as a singular individual that is eternal, that is partless, that is independent of all else. Not so. Not so either metaphysically or metapsychically, not so ontologically or cognostically. And in order to say not so and make such an assertion, we have to use the particular terminology that we have. So what we are doing in selfology is we are expanding our connotations of what the self is. We are looking at the prefigured ways that we have understood the self. First of all, as just myself. And we're taking a comprehensive look of what the self actually entails, such as what is the whole self? Well, it's not only myself, but it's everything else that's included within the macrocosmic self. And it's not only that, but on an infinitesimal level, there are microcosms of which I as a, minocosms, that I as a microcosm am established. I'm constituted myself of forms that are not the form that I inhabit as the form that I inhabit. The form I inhabit as a body. What do I know about? Do I see directly the veins and the corpuscles that are flowing throughout my vehicle, my bodily vehicle? No, none of us do. We don't see our brains. We don't see the back of our eyes, right? We're not looking at our retinas. We don't see our own brains. That's the difference between, for instance, a brain and a mind. A brain never sees itself. A mind does, right? A brain is physical, is here or now. A mind, it can look to the past, it can look to the future, it can apprehend the moment. Altogether different. So when I use these terms and I define them in such and such a way, you, as a re-notating entity who is thinking things over, mulling it over, come to your own conclusions, and then that becomes part of your idionotation. But all of this is occurring because of possible meanings. And it is the philosopher who takes, therefore, the individual particular meanings that we all experience in our everyday, ordinary lives, and integrates it with our transfinite experiences that are going on psychically as an experiencing being that has thoughts and feelings and volitions, as well as activities and actions that we project in space. And the philosopher builds not only those finite and particular meanings under the categories of the larger psychical and even abstract meanings, but it all takes place according to the holistic interpretation of meanings that are found within the greater scape. And that greater scape is what underpins both our inner scape and our outer scape. You couldn't have these exterior events without the potential for them to occur. You couldn't have an actual thought without first there being the potential for it to occur. Think on this. Selfologize. Is this not the case? There must be the potential for something to be before it actually is. So until we meet again, behave when you must, be good, whatever you can, but above all else, be yourself.